Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast so often, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them, can they? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak, for the patch pulls away from the cloak, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Otherwise the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she said to herself, "If only I touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned and seeing her said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout the district. As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying loudly, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their eyes were opened. Then Jesus sternly ordered them, "See that no one knows of this." But they went away and spread the news about him throughout that district. After they had gone away, a demoniac was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, the one who had been mute spoke, and the crowds were amazed and said, "Never has anything like this been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "By the ruler of the demons, he casts out the demons."
I'd like to pray to start. God, thanks. Thanks for this text and these stories and these people. And we show up at various different spots in our journeys with you, and yet we're in the room, and thus, on some level, we're availing ourselves to you. So we love you and trust you. Amen. So, if you've not been with us, maybe ever before, welcome if that's the case, or in a while. We've been in this series that we've been calling the Gospel According to Matthew, because that's the book that we're reading. And we started this series way back, actually, it was the Sunday after Easter, so I think that was April 19th. And at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. We didn't know why we were doing it. I didn't know why we were doing it, other than it just felt cathartic. But I think what's becoming more clear is that something about this cultural moment and these present times and the incredible polarizing nature of so many conversations, the politicizing of everything, the ideology that seems like it's everywhere, I think maybe the value of this is that it helps us kind of make this confession that we're not trying to be a progressive church, and we're not trying to be a conservative church, that as best we can in this present moment, though we can't do it perfectly, we're just trying to figure out what does it look like to follow Jesus, and what would it look like if we did follow Jesus in this season, and maybe in that respect, offering a third way, not just to ourselves, but to those around us. And so you're kind of, all that to say, you're also kind of catching us middle of the movie, if you will, because we're now 9 chapters into the Gospel of Matthew, and that's okay. But the question that I want to put out there this morning, and I'm less intimidated this gathering, because last gathering, one of my favorite seminary professors was here. He's become a friend and a family, and him and his son were in town, and all week I prepped, like, Dr. Bruner's going to be in the room at the 9. Dr. Bruner's going to be at the 9. So, it feels better this time. Because what I want to do this morning is, obviously, what David just read us was a series of stories. And as is the case with the text, as is the case with the Bible in general, like we could slow down and we could handle each one of those and pull from them great meaning and insight and understanding of God and ourselves. What I want to suggest this morning, though, is that Matthew, the author, that what if part of what he's doing here is kind of offering us a bunch of stories as one story, which is to say that what if what Matthew's doing here is offering one, what you might call a summarizing story, that he's 9 chapters in, and if you think about it, what he's been up to thus far, if you've been with us, or even if you're just familiar with the text, and if not, all the way back to Jesus' baptism, which happened in Matthew chapter 4, what he's been doing is casting this wide net and inviting people to rethink their plans for living and take up his whole new way of doing life. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. It's this invitation to follow Jesus, to take up this new idea, to be open to new ideas. And what we've seen is that different people are responding in different ways. And frankly, the extent to which he's making it available, it's also very broad. We've had lepers, we've had religious people, we've had men, we've had women. And there's even been hints at people who that this will also extend not just to Jewish people, to Gentiles. But the question I want to ask is, what if what Jesus is doing here, or Matthew's doing here with these stories, is offering a kind of summarizing story or a summary story for the way people have been responding to Jesus? And in doing, what if he's also summarizing for us the different ways we respond? Not just one time, but throughout our life or even in given circumstances. You can think of it this way, like think of the vacations you've been on, the trips maybe that you took this summer, and whether they're a week or they're a weekend, or even something like a wedding or something where you spent thousands of dollars on some kind of an event like a birthday celebration or an anniversary celebration or a wedding. Like if you notice that the human tendency is we kind of capture the whole experience. Usually there's one story that kind of becomes the archetypal story of that trip. And if everything about that trip was a disaster, then the story is the flat tire. And if everything about that trip was funny, then there's this other story that kind of captures it. I was thinking about that this week, and a handful of years ago, my family and a couple good friends, we had kind of I think we'd been in this small town in Montana. If you ask me off the record, I'll tell you which one it was. But there was a small town in Montana that we noted one Saturday on a road trip that there was this great little brewery and this great little hot springs. And so we'd talked. It was one of those like, hey, we should go do that someday. And my wife, being who she is, she reminded us of that, and eventually we did go do that. And so we took this Saturday. She's good at adventure, and we went to this town, and some of us needed the brewery before we could go to the hot springs, so we did the brewery thing. And then we went to the hot springs, and I think I've even told this story before, but it's an iconic story for me. We were at the hot springs. We were standing in line, and again, think Montana, small town hot springs, like, am I going to get a disease here? You know, those kinds of moments. And we were second in line, and first in line was this woman, and she apparently knew what we knew, but she was taking advantage of what we had chose not to take advantage of. And that was, while also having to pay for your admission, if you had the unfortunate experience of forgetting your swimming suit, you could rent one. Men and women, just $1. So we're standing in this line, and this customer gets to the front of the line, and there's this, small town kind of hot springs place, so semi-crusty kind of lady is working, and the customer said, I'd like to rent a bathing suit. And the gal behind the counter said, okay, what size? And the customer went like, and she did this, 8? And the gal goes, small, medium, or large. So let me know. You could have your own adventure. But my point is, so there's this whole day, and that moment just kind of, in my head, that's how I remember that day, because there was this one moment that kind of just speaks to all the other moments. What if that's what Matthew's doing here? What if what he's done is put together these stories that don't seem all that connected? And remember, Matthew's not bound by chronology. Part of what we have to remember when we read the Gospels is that he's taking stories, the Gospel writer Matthew, but he doesn't have to put them in a correct order, any more than when you're eulogizing somebody. It's not important that all the stories happen chronologically. He's putting them together to tell the story of Jesus. And it seems an unlikely pair of stories, but what if what he's saying is, hey, there's a few ways that there's a few ways that people in general respond to Jesus. Well, what would they be? Well, look at verse 34. It's kind of towards the end of that section. Well, it is the end of that section. But he says this, but the Pharisees said, by the ruler of demons, he casts out the demons. Now, if you've been tracking with us in Matthew, or if you're familiar with Matthew, then what you already know is from very early in the story, there's been a group of people, oftentimes religious people, who are very closed to Jesus. Like they already know how God works, and he's not working that way. Jesus isn't, so this isn't God. They already know how life works, and it's not working that way, and so he's bad. And what's happened, the progression of what's happened with this third group that I'm going to call closed to Jesus, what's happened is it started as what seemed to be kind of a hesitation. It became stronger as it progressed. And by now, this is, I think, the second time we've seen this theme. Jesus is no longer bad, he's evil. And as we follow Matthew, I don't know how much longer this is, it's probably going to take us all the way into 2023, I don't know. But as we follow Matthew, what you'll see is that this group continues to build a head of steam until they're not satisfied until Jesus is dead. Now again, I think one way to think about this group is they were closed. They already decided, they already knew, the sentence was already finished for them. The period was ready at the end of the sentence for them. Okay, so who would be the second group? Well, look at verse 33. And it says, and when the demon had been cast out, the one who had been mute spoke, and the crowds were amazed, and says, never has anything like this been seen in Israel. That word crowds there, we've seen them too. They were there for the Sermon on the Mount. They've been there for some healings. They've been there for some moments where demons were cast out. They've been there for some different teachings. And in fact, Matthew, they'll stay in the story. It's a group. In fact, Matthew references the crowds 34 different times in his gospel. And the last time that he mentions them maybe tells us everything that we need to know about the crowds. In chapter 27, we're now at the point where Jesus was condemned to death. It says this, so when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. So if the first group is closed, well, how do we think of this second group? And I wonder if the answer isn't they're intrigued, they're amused, they're entertained, they're intellectually engaged, none of which are in and of themselves bad things. But maybe the question that Matthew's trying to bring to the surface is, what does faith look like? What does it look like to follow Jesus? What is it that Jesus is actually hoping for from people? Is he looking for people who are closed? Is he looking for people who, maybe you could use the word amused? Is that the response he's looking for? Okay, so then who would be this other group? And I wonder if that's not where the whole thing about fasting comes in. We're going to talk a lot about fasting around Thanksgiving, ironically, so I'm going to kind of save some of that. But fasting, of course, is a time of grieving. It's a time where you bring your physical into alignment with your spirit, and part of it's going like, this isn't that time. There's this new time. We don't fast on our birthday, we party, we celebrate. And there's this whole thing about wine and wineskins. Again, what is that? It's a picture of something new is happening, and this new thing is oftentimes unacceptable by the old thing. I think that's what's happening right now in 21st century American following of Jesus church land. What it looks like to follow Jesus today, it seems like is fundamentally different than it did 2 years ago. Are we open to that? Are we willing to kind of go like that version of following Jesus? It worked. But it has to be different now. But then the stories keep going. What's with this synagogue leader? What's going on there? Well, as is the case with lots of stories, we don't know everything about him. We know that a synagogue leader was by very nature, in a small community like this, in a Jewish community, they were a very prominent person. Think popular teacher or business owner, city council member, mayor, like they were a big deal. And he comes to Jesus, why? Because his daughter has died. And we'll explore a little bit next week. There's another theme here that I want to pull on next week. But his daughter has died, and he comes to Jesus, and he what? Does he with great dignity request his help? No. He literally throws himself on the ground. How is his response different than these other responses? And what does it cost him if it doesn't work out? He's gone all in if this doesn't turn out the way he hopes. Not just with his daughter, with his child, but with his reputation. And then there's this woman who's been bleeding. We're told she's been bleeding for 12 years. I didn't take the time to work this out, but I have to think that 12 there has some parallels to Israel and 12 tribes. I didn't try to work that out. Whether or not it's a literal 12 years, I don't think is probably the point. It's a long time. And of course, this is a culture that had some pretty strong rules around the extent to which a woman during her menstrual cycle could be touched, what happened. And remember, we've talked before, this isn't about sin, no sin. It's easy to look at stories like this and go, man, the early scriptures, the Bible, God is such a misogynist. But remember, this is a pretty male-heavy culture. And the other way to look at this is that God put in place protective measures for women that probably they didn't have the ability to put in place for themselves. There were big implications for a woman in this season, but so were there for people who might try to do something with her or to her. All the same, she's been bleeding for 12 years, and what we don't know, well, what we do know, is she knows the kind of emotional and physical exhaustion that comes with exercising every opportunity with the medical field and having that not turn out to be helpful. What we don't know is whether or not she's married or has ever been married. To me, it seems most likely that this is a woman who's been single her entire adult life. Why? Well, because it'd be hard to find a husband, especially in this culture. If she's not been single her whole life, it seems even more likely that the extent to which she was once married, she's not anymore. She's been cast aside. The other question I think is important to ask is, does she have children? I mean, at what point did this all begin for her? And then there's more questions, like what becomes of a woman in this culture who has neither a husband nor a child? What occupation is available to them? And is that, ironically, is prostitution even an option for this woman? See, there's this sense of, like, what's the emotional place of the synagogue leader? And what's the emotional place of this woman? Like, how desperate is she? And then there's these two blind guys. They identified how they hear about Jesus, we don't know. But Jesus comes walking by, and they draw much attention to themselves by saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on us. Now, what's making more and more sense to me, the idea I'm becoming persuaded by, is that Matthew is actually writing to a Jewish audience in Syria who's being persecuted by their fellow Jews. But either way, Matthew's Jewish audience, they would have understood that son of David idea. It's like saying, for those of you who follow football, yeah, Trevor Lawrence is the next Tom Brady. In the world of music, I don't know what the analogy would be. It's like saying this seventh grader she's going to be the next president of the United States. It's assigning a massive responsibility to somebody. Son of David, this is what the hopes of Israel are tied to. And probably, in this case, the title is assigned not just to a Messiah, but a military government leader who will come and reestablish the government of Israel and kick these foreign Romans out, and they will once again have their reign like David did during his great run. But I think this speaks so much to Matthew's literary genius, if not comedic wit. Who were the first people in Matthew's gospel to see Jesus for who he was? A couple blind guys. Again, what's Matthew doing there? What category would you put these guys in? And then there's another demoniac. What category do you put these people in? Maybe you could ask it this way. If you wake up in the morning and you insist upon telling your life how it's going to go, if you wake up in the morning and you've studied God so that you can tell God what God can and cannot do, what group of people, what kind of response does that put you in company with? If you wake up in the morning, or if your response to Jesus is more akin to this, to applause, to being entertained, to going, oh, that's intriguing, Jesus, I'm intellectually stimulated, way to go, Jesus, bravo, bravo. What group does that put you in? And listen, no one's more prone than me to want to follow a Jesus who just cares that I read my Bible that morning and had some kind of intellectual insight and then to go off and live my life. But what if religion's all about what happens between your ears, what group does that put you among? And then there's this other question of, okay, so how would you describe this third group? And maybe even more so, what would be the behaviors, emotional as well as like actual? What would be the actions of the people who are in this third group? What would be your actions that would confirm to you that you're actually a part of this group that it seems that Jesus is pushing for, the group that become identified as his? There's a guy named Tim Mackey, and I'm indebted to him. I put the message that he gave on this, or the lecture on the Mind Map, the podcast. But he uses the phrase open, which is ironic in our time and maybe fitting. That notice that if the first group is closed and the second group is amused or amazed, the third group has suspended all judgment. They've released much control. They're wide open to the idea that God may be up to something other than what we thought was possible. Mackey says it this way. Go ahead to that slide. Thanks, Sean. He says, Faith says, because of Jesus, there are possibilities I haven't imagined. Now, can that get kind of twisted and toxic? Of course it can. Anything can. But what is the response that Jesus is looking for? Isn't it this openness? This idea of, well, this is what I thought it was going to be like if I got this job. This is what I thought life, like how much different is your life today than the one you imagined for yourself 2 years ago? And is the posture that God would call us to kick and scream and pout and be angry? And to what extent would the posture be like, oh, God, I don't actually understand what's happening. I don't know what's happening. But does faith require that we always know God's next move, or is faith about acknowledging we can trust God's next move even though we can't predict it or see it? I think the opportunity of this section is to go, how is this playing itself out in your life? As you parent, as you function as an employee, as you exist in a new season of your marriage, as you own a business, as you try to follow Christ. To what extent is God calling you to be closed, and to what extent is he calling you to just be amused? And is it possible that the proper response is this kind of surrendered while still planning response of, Lord, what are you doing? And yet you are trustworthy. Mackey goes on to point out that, like, just the obvious, and it feels obvious once you say it, but I didn't think of it at that. He just says, think about how open you have to be to follow Christ. Like, you have to be open to the idea that a guy who died actually didn't stay dead but rose again 3 days later, and that historical event somehow broke the chains of evil and sin on the world in a way where God's future came into its present, and while we're not fully living in it now, it's unfolding all around us. You have to be open to the idea that Christ, who didn't come back as a ghost but came back as a physical being and then did ascend to heaven, that Christ is still present to us today via his Spirit. And then you've got to be open to the fact that our fundamental assumptions about what it means to be human are oftentimes much different than Jesus' intentions for what it means to be human. Which means you've got to be open to the fact that there are going to be major moments in your life where God has permission to go, hey, that's a bad idea. You're wrong on this one. You have to be pretty open. I guess my question is, what's the response that Jesus is asking for? And what if what Matthew's doing here isn't trying to kind of create these three sections where you can feel good about yourself if you're in one of them, but more or less to warn us that the Jesus life is one in which we will constantly be pulled to being closed and constantly be pulled to just being amused. My friend Fred used to always say, Jesus isn't looking for fans. He's looking for followers. And yet the hard work of following Jesus is to wake up in the morning. And by the way, I don't think this is permission to not have plans. I'm gonna claim that hill securely. Man makes his plans, God determines his steps. I still think we get to plan. But think of how Jesus' half-brother said it, James. Like, if it's the Lord's will, then we'll go this way or that way. What if the Jesus life is one where we wake up in the morning and we invite God to identify for us those places where we're telling life how it's gonna work? And we're telling God how he does and doesn't work. And instead, the life of faith is trusting that what our hopes are staked to is his trustworthiness, not our understanding thereof. And all this reminded me this week of the very first wedding I did after moving to Helena. It was this great young couple, and I had this idea for the ceremony. And it was one of those deals where, like, before the ceremony, it was a great idea. In the middle of executing the idea, I was like, what am I doing? And I've never done it since. So we all can probably relate to that. Well, what was going on is I was doing the ceremony for this couple, and there's this fantastic, kind of great, idyllic, kind of young Christian couple. And as I think it was on the other side of the vows. It's a little foggy. It's been a while. But there was this point where, as I recall, like after exchanging the vows of I'll love you and I'll cherish you and I'll honor you in sickness and health, all of that, and both had done that, and I think those are important. There's this point where I just looked at the groom and I said, what if she doesn't? Like, what are you going to do if she just changes her mind? Like, what if 5 years from now she just says, I'm out? And I feel like I just watched his jaw hit the ground. Like, you might as well have just dumped a bunch of cold water on my head. And I turned and I looked at her and I asked the same questions. Like, What if he quits? What if he changed his mind? And what I was driving at, I think what I was driving at was something I was experiencing in my own life, which was there was people that I trusted that were pounding into me this idea, like, Adam, marriage isn't about ownership. It's not about ownership. More recently, I heard Dallas Willard, one of his statements is that Christian friendship is never about possessing the other. I've kind of wondered as I reflected on that, I even wonder if sometimes our language, like best friend, is a possessive term in a way that's maybe not all that healthy. What I was trying to get them to was this place, and actually what I said, and again, I haven't done it since, I realized, like, not the place, Adam. As I said, I think the answer is there's nothing you can do. Like, that's what marriage is. It's that vulnerable. Now, are there things you can do to build beachheads against that? Sure. Are there things that you could do that could expedite or make that more likely? Of course. But the reality is, marriage is this vulnerable stepping into a relationship where you don't have guarantees. And what I have adapted into since then is, rather than doing that, it's just that when I talk about the rings, I love to talk about the difference between contract and covenant. Because there's nuance to this, of course, but in general, a contract is a vote of no confidence in the other person. If I signed a contract with you, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, what I'm saying is it's not important that I trust you. I trust this system that will protect me from you if you choose not to be trustworthy. But a covenant, especially the ancient Near Eastern version of a covenant, it's the opposite. When two people entered a covenant together, what they're saying is, I'm all in on who you are. I'm in on your character. I'm fully vulnerable to your person. I wonder if baptism is a formation of a covenant. That what we do when we step into the life of faith with God, it's not the work of, like, we have guarantees other than we have the guarantee, or at least the promise, that God is good and can be trusted. Apostle John starts his first letter, God is light, in him there is no darkness. But maybe it's important that we have the ability to differentiate that God is trustworthy from, and therefore I know what his next move will be. And therefore, because I have all this theology in my head, I can tell God how life works. What if the life of faith is one where we perpetually surrender? Your kingdom come, your will be done. We perpetually surrender our need to tell life how it's going to go, and know that the promise that we carry, the covenant that we live in, is one in which God says, you can trust me. So the band comes forward, and they're going to lead us in a couple more songs, and the ushers come forward to get ready for communion. You guys can do that now. To me, the questions that give you the chance to maybe noodle on here for the next few minutes are kind of obvious. First of all, I think maybe there's some value if you're at this place where you're just really closed on something with God. Maybe you do yourself and those around you a great justice by just naming it. Of just saying, I'm just closed on this issue. Don't try to talk me out of it. Don't try to reason with me. I'm just closed. And that can be a great service to those of us who love you, because it's a reminder that we need to talk to God more about our friends than our friends about God. And if you're in this posture, quite frankly, and I'm so honored that there's many of you who are in this place in your own journey of faith, like you've not committed, and that's okay. You're intrigued. You're checking it out. That's great. But maybe it's also good to remind ourselves, like, that's also not the end game goal that Jesus is looking for. And if nothing else, maybe for you the question is, okay, what's the circumstance? What's the relationship? Where's the heat? Where the invitation is, okay, God, I'm understanding. It's not my job to tell life how it's supposed to go. It's not my job to tell you what you do and don't do. It's my job to stay open to your trustworthiness in this circumstance as well. And maybe just using communion as this reminder. Like, the cross ultimately says God is trustworthy. Because over and over and over again in the text, people don't keep their end of the bargain, and God does, and that's what earns him the cross. Jesus, thanks that you were trustworthy despite our wandering ways. Thanks, God, that you're even faithful to us even when we're not even sure you're there. Pray that you make us the kinds of people who trust you and the kinds of friends who trust you. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.